Hi, I'm D, a musician who started out as a classical pianist, performed as a jazz bassist, and is now becoming an aspiring producer. My music taste spans around many genres from R&B, jazz, funk, classical, but K-pop always seems to stand out on its own from the general pop genre, with its very unique way of combining all the genres I love into one. To learn more about music though, and how to make better music, I often do my own transcriptions, practice sessions, or analysis of K-pop songs from a classical or jazz musician's perspective, because that's the perspective that I have most experience with. And by analyzing the techniques that the greatest K-pop producers use in their songs, I'm able to apply their techniques in my own writing until I master them and make them my own. I created this series in order to share what I've discovered through my own analysis, so you also can apply and understand them in your own music too. Today we will be looking at one of my top 3 boy group songs for 2019. The whole N.O.'d album is art, but 17's Fear is definitely one of my favorite 17 songs. It's aggressive and loud and in your face, but so catchy, and an interesting representation of fear that they hold. I heard Woozy helped produce the song, or actually produced most of the song, and he's a very talented dude. In fact, one of my inspirations for being a producer too. Anyway, let's get right into it. This is the art in not fearing the musical essentials. First, we have to start off with what this song is about before we get into any analysis, so we understand what we're looking for. So the theme of the song is pretty obvious. I mean, it's in the title, fear. However, if you look at the lyrics, you'll notice that it wasn't just that obvious. Listen to this from the description of the music video. 17 explores fear as an emotion as they face during their creative process. As the members search within for insight, the agony they endure help them develop one step further as an artist. So it's more about the fear that comes within a person rather than the fear of something outside of their control. This song is more about the mental tension and the fear that they encounter rather than actual objects that they fear. We certainly see this in the choreo and the music video, but it's time to take a look at the music for a more in-depth analysis. Okay, if you haven't watched any of my other analysis videos, this is basically how I structure my analysis of a song. Since K-pop is more of a group of genres rather than a single one, I break down each section of a song, look how it is created within the section using different genres, and then look at how it is put together to create one cohesive whole song. Alright, so let's listen to this intro first before we analyze it. 넌 내 기억을 지워야 돼 I'm poison I know I can't take it no more Very cool. Alright, so the biggest thing here is listen to how the intro sets up the tone for the rest of the piece. And notice how immediately the singer, I think it's Wonwoo, is already setting a pretty aggressive tone with his voice. So together, we know something is wrong already at the beginning of the song. His voice has a screaming like quality to it. So let's listen to that really quick again. But it's not just straight up screaming. Later we'll see how having 13 members is really valuable for the variation of vocal tone later in the song. But this screaming type quality already sets a pretty fearful tone at the beginning. It does build up a little up to the first verse just at the very end. And we will see how that affects the tone and ambience of the first verse. Also, there's a lot of going on in this instrumental, but I don't want to say too much in the intro, just because this intro is really similar to the chorus. So I'll actually go in more in depth with the instrumental once we get to the chorus. Okay, so now that we've listened to the intro, let's look at the verse. Nice. Okay, so in the beginning, there's this really abrupt pause. A lot of people call this a Frankenstein method. So you'll notice that this first verse is totally different than the intro. And you see this a lot in K-pop because there are so many different genres. So you notice a lot of times that they'll just make an abrupt stop to show some type of quick change in tone. The first verse has some very light and airy type instrumentals, and the bass isn't as heavy. If we listen one more time, the bass is not as intense as it was in the intro or as it will be in the chorus. It's much more lighter to match a lighter tone and create more of that contrast. They also took out all the heavy synths and made it so that only lighter instruments are there to again create that light tone. And higher notes tend to have a happier feeling, so they definitely avoid the really higher notes. So a lot of the instruments here are more mid-range, down to earth, not necessarily lower range. You'll see once we get into the chorus, they start getting lower and more intense, to really represent that anger. But right now they're mid-range, so they're almost impartial between happiness and sadness. If you listen really closely, even the hi-hat, which is traditionally a higher frequency, is pitched much lower, so it's closer to the snare in that mid-range frequency. So they get a lot of that consistency in that mid-range. Another thing I wanted to point out was the drums are pretty quiet in this section. And that's a really interesting choice. Usually drums are there to set up the groove of the song, but they felt it wasn't as necessary in the verse, especially since a lot of the rappers are in the verses, so they already set the groove of this section. So they lowered the drums because it wasn't as necessary to set that type of groove. Okay, so now let's listen to this pre-chorus. Very cool. Okay, so here I noticed a couple things. First of all, a lot of the musical ideas are very similar to Bon Chocolat's pre-chorus. So if you haven't seen my analysis on that, I'll link it down below. But anyway, the long and held out bass, which wasn't held out in the other parts, allows the instrumental on the top to have lots of support, and support is really essential in the chorus, because it allows stacking instruments to push through the sound. What a bass's role is to give a platform for higher notes to ride on so they can travel farther. So now that the bass is nice and long and held out, compared to the verses and choruses where it's not there constantly, notice that you'll see that the pre-chorus is now a lot more stable because of that bass, and it's allowed to build even farther. Okay, to build, there is this really common snare line that they use, so I actually transcribed it so we can look at this specifically. You can hear what it sounds like, so let's listen to that. Alright, nice. So, first of all, it builds intensity by making the snare faster, and you'll see this very common. Well, it doesn't actually get faster, but it repeats more and more. We associate repeating or repetition, more repetition, to be more intense because it's very similar to like a heartbeat. When something's very intense, your heartbeat naturally tends to get very fast. Your heart rate goes up, right? So, that's another easy thing you can do in your music to build intensity. Again, there's a very common technique here at the end too, where they just take out all the instruments to emphasize this bass drop even more. What this does is it gives your music some airtime because you're extending the hype that you've built all throughout the pre-chorus just a little bit more, just to psych the listener out one more time before the drop, and that makes it all that more intense. Also, I did want to point out that at the very beginning of each measure, there's a very high instrument there. It's almost like a vocal run in the background. The reason why they put it in the beginning is, first of all, it's the same run all the time, so it's consistent, and it also harmonizes with different chords. You'll notice that a lot of times in pop, you'll have the same run over and over again, but over the same chords, so it harmonizes just a little bit different each time, and it's really cool how they do that. So if you want to do that, you have to make sure that that type of run also fits all the chords. It's also pretty effective putting it at the beginning of each measure because it's able to get out of the way before the rest of the vocals come in, so it gets out of the way so it could let those vocals shine. Okay, so let's listen to this chorus really quick before we analyze it. Oh, super catchy. Okay, anyway, before this chorus, there's this really weird snare line. It sounds like this. First of all, the snare gets lowered in pitch. So that also emphasizes the beat drop even more, because like the bass, it does get lowered. The whole bass drop is more emphasized that way. It sounds like a car screeching to a halt. And this is effective because it shows the listener that something is about to change, right? It's a very abrupt transition, again, the Frankenstein method that I mentioned earlier. But by adding in this screeching halt type of sound, it's able to create a mini transition between two really different sections. Also, this chorus can be very dissonant at times because there's so much going on, and there's a lot of distortion. And what distortion is it emphasizes all the sound waves, right? So if something sounds impure, or the ratio between each frequency isn't as perfect as it could be, like a third instead of a fifth, those frequencies often get really muddy. And that's why this dissonant sound is a little bit effective. Usually you don't want it like this, but when they clash together, it feels like a jumbled, messy mindset that comes with fear. So listen to this dissonance just a little bit here. It feels like something just doesn't match up there, and I think it's really effective, especially between the lower notes and then those higher notes. It's not the low notes that necessarily sound dissonant with each other, but it's the higher notes that do. Okay, let's listen to this second verse. This first part of the second verse is super iconic. There it is. Nice. Okay, so I want to point out a couple things in this second verse. This stop actually happens in the first verse as well, but it's even more abrupt here. There's a lot more silence in this second verse. So again, even if the listener was expecting a stop, it's even more effective, especially since the vocalist whispers to emphasize the silence too. Or it's not necessarily a whisper, but something is very quiet, similar to a whisper. And then the fact that they go into R&B chords here makes the contrast a lot more different than the chorus, because the chorus are just simple no extension chords, but they also are immediately going to R&B chords over here, so this creates really interesting tone. I do also want to point out that you notice that there is this sense of building in the verse and the pre-chorus in the vocalist too. At the beginning of each verse, there is this light sounding vocalist. But as you keep going in the verse, in the pre-chorus, the vocalists start to get more aggressive and scream-like. So there's this building type sensation where you have very light vocalists here, the rappers, and then the vocalists start getting more intense and angrier towards the pre-chorus, and then finally the chorus. I do want to point out something that you might not have noticed. Because this song is so intense, there isn't that much drums here. And the reason they did that is because they don't want the intensity of the drums to match the intensity of the instrumental. If it did, there would just be way too much energy throughout this song. So you'll notice actually that it's in halftime. The snare is only on beats 3. And this is really interesting because usually the snare is on 2 and 4, but they just put it on 3. So everything, especially in the verses, have a laid down, laid back feel. And even when it gets to the chorus, the one that we just heard earlier, it's still not competing in energy with all the loud instruments that are all going on. And it does give a really good head bopping type feel, especially since this song is pretty fast. It was a weird choice to put it in halftime, but also a very good choice as well, because I feel like it would have way too much going on if it was using a regular trap drum pattern that we see a lot in K-pop. So that was really well thought out by the producers. Okay, so in this second pre-chorus, I want to point out something in this pre-chorus specifically so I can explain an idea, because it's pretty much the same as the first chorus, and the ideas in the first chorus are the same as this second chorus, but let's listen to it so I can explain that one idea that I'm talking about. It's in this second half. So if you listen closely, they actually use power chords to build intensity. So let's play a measure so you can hear those power chords. Yeah, so power chords are basically chords that are based off of fifths and technically fourths. It's the root and a note octave higher, and then a fifth from the root. So a fifth from that octave higher is technically a fourth. So technically a chord based on an octave, fifths, and technically fourths. But anyway, the fifth is a very strong and stable interval, so it makes this build feel stable. And that's very important. It doesn't feel wobbly or anything. But I want to explain an idea about reviewing your music. Whenever you're reviewing music, you have to treat it like a paper. When you read each sentence in a paper, you take out all the unnecessary words to avoid being verbose. That way your sentences become a lot more concise. So I bet Woozy and the other producers understood that a full chord here would be unnecessary. They took out the third and other extensions, so it's just the root and a fifth. And this makes this pre-chorus feel a lot more concise. It doesn't feel overwhelming. Especially when there's so much going on in a song like this, you have to make sure everything is musically concise. This song is already very aggressive and has a lot going on, so you don't really need to emphasize this type of anger again by adding in a minor third from the root. This is why knowing the tones of intervals is so important, because you can understand that, look, you don't need this minor third to create a minor sound, because that's already been established through the tone of the vocalist and the instruments. You could take that out, take that minor third out, and just use a fifth to get the job done. Okay, so in this second chorus, this first part is the same as the first chorus, so I want to actually talk about something different. Let's talk about this second chorus. It's actually my favorite part of this song, probably your favorite part of the song too. The dance is great. Let's just listen to it. That's super catchy. Okay, so let's talk about it. They add variation in this second chorus. Usually a second chorus is more intense than the first chorus to add variation and a lot of building throughout the song. But here they actually make it a two-part chorus. And two-part choruses are really common in K-pop because, first of all, it adds another sense to this song and makes the song a little bit more catchy. So if you want to make your song catchy in a way, just add a simple melody and make it and sing that melody with oh, nah, or la, and then repeat it. It's simple and effective. Also, the synth here, it's a bit louder than it was in the first part of the chorus, and it's a lot more stabby. I talk about space a lot, and there's a lot of breaks in between those stabby synths, and that emphasizes the stabbiness of each synth even more, because when you're going from nothing to something really aggressive, there is such a big contrast there than it would be if you went from some sound to more sound. It also replaces a lot of the aggressiveness that was in the first part of the chorus, so it almost takes the role of aggression in this second part of the chorus. And that's a really interesting concept too. Even though there are vocalists, the vocals are are more chant-like than they are aggressive. So the producers actually gave or wanted to keep that type of tone, so they gave that role to a different instrument instead of the vocalist, and that was really interesting. So this bridge is pretty short and sweet, and it's very similar to those pre-choruses. So let's listen to this. That bass is super heavy. First of all, I want to talk about the way they used effects on these vocals. First of all, the vocals have a lot of reverb. It's very ringy. It's probably to counteract this very chant-like section over here, or scream-like section too in the pre-chorus and the choruses, because those are very straightforward and aggressive vocal tones, whereas these are more lyrical, and the addition of reverb really emphasized that lyrical quality to it. This bridge is also really short, and they probably did this to get back to this main hook and emphasize that idea of aggression one more time. And there's a lot of I talk about aggression a lot in this piece, and it really seems like the producers are trying to match fear with very strong emotions, and they do that by aggression to make you feel raged up and to represent really frustrating thoughts when you have fear. Because again, it's not just a simple fear like scared of heights or arachnophobia. It's something much more than that. It's something that they fear about themselves and their own struggles. And those are the real fears that are really hard to overcome. Okay, so finally we got to the outro. So let's listen to this before I get into any analysis. Okay, so this last course is very interesting. They actually do a couple little things that make it a lot more different in style. So first of all, they actually start out this chorus with an insertion of another chord. Right there at the very end. And again, that chord is a lot higher, so it adds more intensity. And as a general rule, anything that's higher is more intense than anything is lower. And you'll also notice that the harmonies that they use are extensions of these chords. So this is finally where they get rid of those basic minor chords and start adding actual extensions. Or actually, it's more of voicing for different parts of a chord. So you'll notice that these harmonies voice these chords a little differently, and it adds a lot of variation because it's something that's familiar, because the rhythm and the sound is the same, but the actual melody is just a little bit different, even though it's very recognizable and familiar to the audience. You'll also notice that right here, these ad-libs sound like they're screaming for help. They're very high intense, but it's almost reminiscent of someone screaming at the top of their lungs, asking for help. It sounds like they're screaming within themselves to find help that they're not able to get, right? And then if we listen to this last section, there's a long echo and a lot of reverb on these last vocals too. And it makes these singers sound exhausted and out of breath. And obviously, they would be out of breath because of the insane choreo. But this exhaustion is a little bit different. It's probably to represent the constant fear that they've been experiencing through their lives. And now they're finally done with it and exhausted with it. Quite an ending. So now that we've analyzed the song, let's talk about the themes that they try to implement in this song. So first of all, they use darker and lighter motifs to add contrast and properly represent this fear that they have. And also, they emphasize a fearful tone that is also paralleled with anger to create this fearful sound that they were going for. And they really represented fear really well. So I think that's about it for this analysis. I had a lot of fun. This is definitely one of my favorite boy group songs of all time. And I really had a lot of fun in analyzing this one. Woozi is a great producer, and he inspires me in so many ways. If I'm gonna do more of these in the future, so let me know what you want me to analyze, and also check out all my other music too. I actually just am starting a project where I'll release a new short of music every single week, and I'll definitely be making more of these analysis videos pretty often. So anyway, I think that's about it. So see ya.